Okay, guys, welcome. This is Wednesday, June 4th. This is Agential Topics. Hi, Henry. We
Hi,
got
everyone.
awesome. Yeah, so this Agential Topics is a group that we formed to talk about um, a new theory of biology. We're trying to figure out what agency is, figure out biological causation. And today we have Kate Nave, the author of Drive to Survive, and she's going to present for us. And we're going to have questions ranging far and wide, hopefully. So I just wanted to begin with a little introduction of where we are as a group here. I'm going to change the settings so I can see myself, and that will show up on the recording so people can hear who's talking here, see who's talking. Um, yeah, so another like point of order is I try to keep people muted. So if you have a question, be sure and like unmute yourself. And if it's too long before your next question, I might mute you again. So be sure and keep checking that. Um, and otherwise, this is fairly unstructured, so don't, everybody feel free, and the new members, feel free to jump in as much as you want. So yeah. So where we are as a group right now was we're kind of we're turning down a different path right now. Where we've been working on this sort of cognition first theory of life, which I have a very like discrete view of what that is, and we spent the last meeting talking about epistolution and sort of what I think about it. Um, so just to summarize in one sentence, the current theory accounts for life, only by selection, and the sources of variation are random, and that process of selection results ultimately in cognition. But we have a problem with that because organisms can regenerate and reorganize themselves, which is bad enough. But then also those reorganizations are heritable, which is even worse. And so there's lots of new evidence that's making us invent a wild new theory of biology, which is supposing that the sources of variation are cognition. That cognition is the first process, the first order process that enables natural selection. And so, if that's true, we're down a totally wild trail where life isn't about survival and reproduction at all. It's about understanding the world. All cells are minds. DNA is not a replicator; it's a memory, and it reframes the whole thing. But now we've been out on that limb for like several months, and we've kind of explored, I think, a lot of the ideas in literature that exist because it's so like nascent. And now we're kind of taking a step back and going into a deeper sort of field that already has existed for a long time since Varela and Maturana. I think it's in the sort of autopoiesis tradition, and that's this field of thought, that is sort of loosely arranged around the concept of constraint closure. And I think Kate's work, well, she may disagree with me, but I think it fits within that tradition. And we have some other presentations coming up that are very much in that tradition. Rosen and Yogi Yeager and Matt Siegel with Whitehead. And so we're going to be in this tradition for a while. So I really want to like spend some time and try to like enrich, the context here and sort of how people have been thinking about this problem. And I think of it as like the best alternative to the theory that we're kind of working on. But it may turn out that it's the same theory, or that there's a better trail, to go down. So I'm totally open-minded about that, and I'm really excited to see where this ends up. And just yeah, wanted to thank you, Kate, and thank everybody for joining today. And I'll just turn it over to you for a little while.
Great, yeah, thank you for having me. Sorry, I was slightly distracted there because I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen in the best possible way, but hopefully this is going to work. Just give me a second. This is always the stressful part. Can
No
everybody
worries.
see?
We have 2 hours, so no big deal.
I only use like three different video platforms, but I just cannot keep in mind the different ways in which this works on them. Um, but can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Um, and you can see the slide. Sweet, cool.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for the introduction. I guess I could say a little bit about where I'm coming at this from. I'm coming at this from a background in philosophy of cognitive science as somebody who is very compelled by the kind of enactivist sort of approach that you get out of Varela and Thompson and Roche and subsequent people who have built on their work. And I think there's a real issue in that approach where we have this kind of notion of an intentional system that's modeled on a single cell in terms of autopoiesis and self-construction, and a desire to generalize that to systems that aren't just single cells. And often the attempt to generalize the principles of autopoiesis beyond single cells end up, I think, sort of watering down that notion of autopoiesis in ways that cause problems. And around the time I was doing my PhD, which is where the book kind of came from, everybody was talking about the free energy principle as something that kind of formalized autopoiesis. And I thought that sounded cool, so that's what I got into it. And I realized that I think it is another case of how you can describe something that looks when you're trying to identify what it is about living systems that makes them purposive and intentional. It's very easy to pick up on properties that are exhibited by living systems but aren't specific to them, that look like they're capturing what you're after, and you end up with these kind of triviality cases. So that's the kind of backdrop to this. But I'll go into the kind of slides that I have, which is my attempt to sort of explain what I see the free energy principle is trying to do, why I think it doesn't work, and why I think the ways in which it doesn't work have some quite interesting lessons for how we should be trying to think about living systems. So hopefully this will advance. Yeah. So probably everybody's heard of the free energy principle at this point, but it was proposed around 20 years ago, and it's generated a lot of excitement, a lot of popular press coverage. It was initially proposed as this kind of unifying theory of certain sort of neuroscientific aspects of the cortex, so things like structure and dynamics in the cortex. Then it was generalized to be a theory of a unifying principle of the brain. And then in about 2013, Friston published the paper where it was proposed as a unifying principle to explain life as a whole, so everything from the single cell all the way up to the brain. And then more recently, it's been generalized even further to be this kind of theory of everything. And I think that generalization to a theory of everything is what kind of exposes some of these tensions in this principle, because you might think that if something's this principle that applies to every single system that exists over time, it might not tell us much about the things that we're interested in when it comes to what distinguishes living systems. So when it comes to what the free energy principle is and what it says, there's, I think, a lot of different versions of it, which leads to a lot of confusion, certainly when I try to talk to people about it. But the kind of core claim that has been the core of the free energy principle for a long time, I think, can be summarized by this idea that to be a system that exists over time is to be something that repeatedly returns to a small subset of possible states. And one way you can motivate that is this idea that if something doesn't stay within the same kind of states over time, then how can we re-identify it? We need some sort of invariant that we can use to identify the system over time. And that would be these states that the system regularly returns to. And then once you have a system like that, you can split it into two subsystems. So I guess, yeah, the first point to say is if the system is regularly returning to a limited set of states with some variation, that allows you to describe its dynamics with a probability distribution. And in the free energy principle, people often talk about the system not just as being described by that probability distribution, but as encoding that probability distribution via its dynamics. So these systems literally instantiate these probabilistic models, is the way the thinking goes. And then you can divide that system up into two systems, and you just do that based on looking at statistical independencies between, well, conditional statistical independencies between different subsets of that whole sort of space of the larger system. Once you've done that, you then have two dynamical systems that encode or instantiate two different probability distributions. But because they were both factored out of this larger system, you have this kind of guarantee that you'll be able to identify some sort of structural mapping between those two probability distributions. And then based on that, you can kind of talk about it as though one system is encoding a model of the other, because we talk about them both as encoding these probabilistic models through their dynamics. And over time, as we measure their dynamics, we can see that these probability distributions are structurally similar, so that you can kind of map the states of one system onto the likely state of the other. That raises a whole load of issues about what it is for something to encode a model, what it is for something to represent something else, and a whole load of thorny philosophical issues around this idea that just sort of reliable covariation is not enough for representation. But that's, I think, the kind of very minimal sort of idea behind the kind of minimal set of moves behind what the free energy principle is doing. And I think what's important about that is, if we think about it that way, it is placing some kind of constraints on how a system has to behave. It has to have the kind of dynamics that can be represented by a stationary probability distribution, a stationary probabilistic model, so that we can interpret those dynamics as encoding that model. Cool. So that then leads to this talk of this idea of the free energy principle as being a kind of theory of inference, because we can then think, if we're thinking of these two coupled systems as one encoding a model of the other, and trying to minimize the variation and there's a lot of intentional talk here that isn't really justified, but looking as though it is encoding a model of the other, then you can think, what is the kind of process by which you do that? It's inference, and the kind of gold standard Bayesian inference. So then you treat the fact that you've described the dynamics as encoding a model of something else, and the fact that those dynamics are converging upon the dynamics of the other thing based on the interactions between the two, as though one system is sampling from the other and updating its model through a process of Bayesian inference. And I'm not going to go through all of that, but the key kind of point is just that what you're doing when you're updating your model based on Bayes formula is that you are trying to basically minimize long-run average surprise. So you're not just trying to change your model to make each sample as likely as possible. You're trying to change your model so as to balance kind of weighting what you already know against each new piece of evidence. So that's a trade-off that Bayes is essentially the optimal solution for. And then that leads to the kind of I think one of the main confusions with the free energy principle is, what is free energy? Because if Bayesian inference is about minimizing surprisal, or the surprisal of some evidence relative to your model on average, what has that got to do with this free energy term? And the literature, I think, in the free energy sort of discussion hasn't always been super helpful on that. Sometimes free energy is described as something that bounds surprisal by being greater than it, which really doesn't tell you what free energy is. So the kind of the short run pass at what free energy is that if you were trying to do a full Bayesian update with the kind of model of the world that you as a brain have, there are so many different degrees of freedom and possible causes behind all of your sensory stimulation that full kind of, I don't know what you call it, gold standard Bayesian inference would be intractable. So the move that is made in the free energy literature or in the active inference and the free energy literature, is to say, if the brain needs to do Bayesian inference, but it can't, it must be approximating it instead. And the standard approximation technique is something called variational inference. The way that works is, rather than having this really complicated possible model, you just have a much simpler constrained set of probability distributions that can be represented with just a couple of parameters. So standardly you use a Gaussian distribution that can be encoded entirely by just a mean and a variance. And then rather than doing your full intractable calculation, you just progressively vary those parameters in a way that minimizes the collective functional of size change and the size of the change. So you want to minimize how much you're changing those parameters, but you also want to minimize how unlikely each piece of evidence is relative to your model. So what you're doing is you're taking that big complicated calculation and just changing it into this progressive optimization problem with just a few parameters. It means that the kind of probability distribution that you end up with is probably never ever going to be able to match the external world, because it's constrained to this very simple form. But it allows you to know that you'll be able to get the best probability distribution, the best probabilistic model that you can from within that constrained set of possible probabilistic models that you're working with. So what free energy is, that's just the term for this function of both how much am I changing my parameters and how much is that change to my parameters, minimizing the unlikeliness of the evidence I receive. And that's the unlikeliness that gets described as surprisal, which is, again, an unhelpfully psychologistic term. And that's all that free energy is. It's that thing that is a proxy for surprisal with a constrained model that doesn't have all of the degrees of freedom that you would be drawing upon if you were doing a full Bayesian calculation. Cool. So all that allows you to do is to converge upon one probability distribution from a set of possible distributions that best minimizes long-run average surprise of your sensory samples. And that kind of raises a question, because you might wonder, like, how could that kind of time invariant stationary model represent our world? Because our world isn't stable. It doesn't have stable statistical properties. We have all of these processes that change over time that don't recur. We have, cliffs eroding, trees growing, all of these things. They're not stable statistical processes. They are sort of a time-dependent path from states that will never recur to states that weren't possible previously. So this kind of model is good for things like planetary rotations and pendulums, but less good for these kinds of historical processes. And the example I like to use is, say you're trying to model the average position of a herd of cats. You can't do that because they don't have an average. This is actually just a clip from an Old Spice advert, so I only get 2 seconds of it. It's very hard to get a sort of visualization of cats dispersing across the plains, but this is exactly what I had in mind. And the point there is, it's not just that trying to figure out their average position is really hard. It's that they don't have an average position, because their average position doesn't stabilize over time. So there's nothing for a probabilistic modeler to really be able to learn here. What do? What active inference involves is introducing the possibility of action. Because by acting to reduce the surprisal or unlikeliness relative to your model, you're not just minimizing that unlikeliness or surprisal. That's one thing you're doing. So one way you minimize unlikeliness relative to your model is making the sensory evidence fit your model. But by doing that, you're also turning the world into the kind of thing that has these stable statistical properties. So now that sort of bunch of cats does have an average position. And that's quite a neat solution, I think, because it does sort of get you this story where this very limited representational format, if you use that to direct your action on the world to make it fit that representational format, then it starts to seem a little more, a little less useless than it seemed if you thought the world was always changing its statistical properties. So under this kind of story, what free energy minimization is describing is not just one system modeling another, which already has stable statistical properties, but 2 systems converging upon the same statistical sort of behavior. And I like the kind of cats coupled to the wobble board is illustrating that. And that means that you no longer have that kind of asymmetry that we began with, where we thought of the kind of world out there and the agent that was shifting itself to correspond to that world. Instead, we have this kind of symmetric relationship between these 2 systems that are collectively converging upon a state that neither of them initially began in. And that looks cool in some ways, because it looks like this sort of marvelously naturalistic reduction of what an inferential process is. It's just the coupling between two systems as they converge to a collectively stable state. And so to infer is to just reduce the variability of two coupled systems. So that's sort of like the connection between a very rough patch at the connection. Oh God, that's not great. Between the free energy principle and the kind of inferential story that it's often connected to. I think what I'm interested in is the kind of constraints that places on the sort of systems that we can say comply with this principle. If this is a principle, what kind of systems can comply with it? And there's a nice statement by Friston from a 2018 paper when he says, we're only interested in one sort of system. That is, processes where the neighborhood of certain states are revisited time and time again. And that describes a lot of biological processes like cardiorespiratory cycles or temperature regulation. So we need stable tendencies over time, such that like our whole probabilistic framework is going to kind of get a foothold. And we also need this requirement of stable dependencies between the parts of the system, because that's what allows us to take that coupled system and split it into two separate subsystems so that we can treat one as modeling the other. And that requires a whole other sort of set of tools that I'm not really going to go into, but it's just based on the idea that you can look for relationships of statistical independence between, once you have this big probabilistic model, you look for relationships with conditional statistical independence between the different parts of that model, and that allows you to parcel these different variables up into subsets and treat some as the internal states of your agent, some as the external states of the world, some as the sensory states, and some of the active states. And we can like talk about that more in the discussion. But it means that it needs to be the case that if something has always interacted with something else via this third thing, and that third thing gets called your sensory motor interface or your membrane if you're a cell, then that pattern of interactions needs to be stable over time. And if something from the world part kind of waltzes through, doesn't interact with your sensory motor interface or your cell membrane and goes straight onto the inside of the model, it's going to break down this kind of, onto the inside of the system. It's going to break down this whole model of the interactions that we've built up, and this sort of active inference or free energy style description of the system is going to fail. So we need stable patterns of behavior over time and stable interactions over time. Cool. So that's, I think, just like my very, very quick attempt to get across what kind of constraints this description places on the kind of systems that we can talk about within this framework. But as I said, it's called a it's often been presented as a principle and something that's supposed to capture something really fundamental about life. And just a couple of kind of quotes that present it in these terms. Wanziraisi and Friston state that it accounts for a basic form of goal-directedness that is characteristic for basic forms of intentionality. And it does so providing this very general answer to the question, what should a system do in order to stay alive? So it's no longer just a description of certain types of systems, it's supposed to be this description of what living systems have to do. They have to maintain this kind of stable dynamics, a stable return to the same sort of states over time. And that's a very old idea. I mean, it's in many ways just a redescription of what it is to be homeostatic. And the idea that it captures what the purpose of the system is essentially like one of the key ideas of the kind of cybernetics tradition in the mid-1900s. The kind of classic paper for that would be the paper by Norbert Wiener, Arturo Rosenbluth, and Julian Bigelow, where they declare that purposiveness just is this kind of behavior controlled by feedback. It's just this kind of homeostatic behavior. And in that paper, they describe it as a property of, or in their work, they describe it as a property of organisms and also of the kind of machines that we design. So it's this sort of non-biochauvinistic principle of purposiveness. It doesn't restrict it arbitrarily to living systems. It could be a dynamic that anything might exhibit, including an artificial system. And that does seem like something compelling about that. Homeostasis is something that this kind of tendency to regulate states and keep them within stable variables is clearly like a pervasive feature of living systems. But as the cybernetician Ross Ashby recognized, and not all of the cyberneticians really saw this way, but I think Ashby understood this principle most clearly. This isn't just the behavior of living systems, and it's not just the behavior of interesting mechanisms. The tendency to return to a stable state is just this very generic property of most physical systems. You can think of it as just the tendency of any system to dissipate an input of energy, to return to like the bottom of an energy well where it's most stable. And Ashby has this nice quote where he says, in simple systems, it's usually trivial and uninteresting. It's the pendulum hanging vertically. And all that makes the change from trivial to interesting is simply the scale of events. So his point is that if you think that this is all there is to purposiveness, which is what Ashby thought, then what you're saying is there's nothing distinctively purposive about life. This is just a very generic, trivial behavior of everything. And for Ashby, that's cool because he wanted to eliminate the notion of purposiveness. And it explains why we kind of confuse ourselves into thinking that it's a real thing, because we're misled by these really complicated systems to think that something else is going on. But all that's really going on is the tendency of physical systems to settle into an equilibrium. In some cases, like a computer or a living system, that might be a very complicated process that looks like there's something extra, some extra ingredient, but it's just the tendency of physical systems to return to rest. So you might think that Ashby's right, that the free energy principle has described living systems. It's wrong to think that there's some sort of inherently purposive aspect to this tendency to return to the same sort of set of states over time, but the description is good. And a sort of move that is now made in the more recent literature is to kind of embrace that view. So there's been this real shift from thinking that this explains the emergence of meaning, significance, and valence, that it draws a bright line between life and non-life, or distinguishes biological systems, to treat the sort of tendency to return to the same set of states in response to disruption as just a generic physical tendency of everything, and revealing that we should be eliminativists about this distinction. Some people take a different view where they actually end up being panpsychists about it, where they say, yes, it is a property of everything and therefore everything's purposive. But I don't want to take either of those positions. I think there is a real distinction in the way that living systems behave. So I kind of now just going to say a little bit about how living systems violate this kind of description. And that should only take a few minutes. So the first point is that one of the things that we required was that the interactions between the parts of the system are stable over time. And if they're not stable over time, then that system has ceased to exist. So as Friston puts it, it doesn't easily accommodate the fact that the particles that constitute this system can over time wander away or be exchanged or renewed. The canonical example would be the blanket states of a candle flame. And in these cases of rapid particle turnover, we can't identify this consistent way of decomposing our larger system into the subsystems that are the agent, the world, and the sensory motor boundary between them. What's really funny about this little discussion is in this, I think in the 2013 paper, he explicitly contrasts the candle flame with the membrane as this kind of stable boundary. But that kind of abstracts away from the fact that the membrane isn't really a stable boundary. It is continually being regenerated and destroyed. And there is exactly this kind of flux of particles through the membrane that we also have in the candle flame. There's this nice example of cellular slime mold where they can turn over their entire cell membrane in just a few minutes. And that's actually how they move. So they destroy the membrane at the rear edge and then regenerate it at the leading edge. So their entire method of locomotion is through breaking down that boundary that divides them from the world and regenerating it, which is not the kind of process that this sort of modeling framework can describe. So the easy response to that is we say, okay, the boundary between the agent and the world doesn't have to be defined by an actual fixed set of physical components. It can be this sort of invariant formal structure. So we know that changing a wheel on the car doesn't destroy that car and create the new one. we abstract away from the fact that the material components of the membrane are regenerated over time. What matters is there is some sort of stable boundary. I think the problem with that is we can abstract away from that turnover if that turnover isn't relevant. But as we've seen in the case of the cellular slime mold, that turnover is the mechanism by which the system moves. So it's not just a contingent feature, it's how the system does what it does. And that's also the case with all sorts of forms of particle transport in and out of the cell. That depends upon this destruction and regeneration of the membrane. So we're abstracting away from something that seems quite important to that living process. The other point is just that in the later treatments where it's said that the free energy principle reveals there to be no distinction between life and non-life, if this kind of material turnover is a distinctive feature of living systems, and we have a framework that reveals there to be no distinction, but it only does so by ignoring that material turnover, we're not really revealing there to be no distinction, we are just abstracting away from the distinction that there is. And I always like this quote by, well, no, actually, I'll skip that because we don't have time. The other issue with that approach is that if we want to abstract away from material turnover to define our stable system in terms of these kind of formal properties that are preserved, these sort of structural properties, then there needs to be a way in which we can define the structure of the system that is invariant over time. So maybe there's material flux, but there is a stable kind of organization. And I don't think that is possible for living systems either. Because unlike a pendulum or most objects, living systems are the kinds of things that undergo these kind of radical transformations throughout their life process. So the most obvious one is going to be, the transformation of an embryo into an egg and a sperm into an embryo into a fully differentiated sort of human adult. And weirdly, we have these claims where changing from one stable pattern of the other would change the agent into something else, usually a dead agent. That's how Friston and Au describe this. But the change from an embryo into an adult isn't an embryo dying and a new agent coming into existence. That's not how we usually conceptualize biological identity. We think of you as the same person you were, just a different kind of stage in that process. And that's the kind of thing that this framework can't capture. And these transitions aren't just things that happen, early on. You could think of it as perhaps these are transformations on our path to becoming the kind of stable system that this framework can describe. But these transformations can happen at all these different stages throughout your life. You have metamorphic butterflies and midlife crises. These are a part of what it means to be a living system as well. And they are precisely the change from one stable pattern of behavior to another. But they're not a death. We can identify the continuity of the living system through that. And I think the reason we can do that is because living systems, what the free energy principle is essentially describing is a good sort of formalization of an object-based ontology, or a essentialist object-based ontology, where existence over time is defined by the preservation of some sort of invariant feature. But we do have other ways of thinking about existence over time that don't depend on that. And I think the continuity of the existence of an eddy in this sort of convection current is a really nice way of capturing that. Because we can follow these and we can track, which eddy is the same eddy across time, even though they're changing not only all of the material that they're made up of, like different particles of, different liquid particles are making up each of those eddies over the kind of duration that you follow it. And its structure and form is also changing. It's not that there are distinctive invariants that are allowing you to identify each of these versus any other. And I think you can kind of see that if you look at these two pictures, which are images of that process, that Rayleigh-Bernard convection process, separated by about 3 or 4 seconds. And if I asked you which of these little eddies in that liquid corresponds to the one 5 seconds earlier, you wouldn't know how to answer that. You don't know what feature to look for, what feature has to be preserved to define that as a particular eddy. But if you just, but if you just play the video, you can watch and you can see that these are, this one, you can map them through following them over time in a way that doesn't depend on the preservation of any invariant material parts or formal parts. I think that's a better ontology for capturing the kind of living systems we're interested in, precisely because of the importance of both material turnover and transformations of structure and form to living systems. And it's not the kind of ontology that the free energy principle allows you to formalize. So, kind of to sum up, survival is this self production, this continuity of a process where each stage is a direct product of the previous stage, but it doesn't require stability. And it's kind of past success in regulating yourself in some particular configuration doesn't guarantee that that's going to be the best configuration for you going forwards. It's a contingent fact that our world does exhibit some stability, and insofar as it does, the free energy principle is going to allow us to describe these processes. But that's not a principle, it's just our best guess. Cool. All right, thank you. Sorry, that took a bit longer than I intended, but.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Um, yeah, I have so many questions. I wanted I wanted first to know, like, how is this free energy principle used? I mean, so what I'm hearing you say, the whole organism is a Bayesian probability distribution. That seems like a really mainstream idea. Like I see that idea everywhere I look now. And but there's an aspect to this whole thing that really strikes me as kind of subversive, which is the like despite the problems you mentioned, which are very serious problems, and you've mentioned a lot more in your book, there's so when they made the jump from saying the free energy principle describes like human level cognition, that this is something that in the downstream end of evolution emerged from this, from this presumably genetic gene derived process at the end. I understand it there. But then when they apply it to all of life and they consider this as like a principle of homeostasis, and they're applying it to all cells, presumably from the beginning, and it's like a prerequisite for life. How is that how is that not um changing the whole relationship between the replicator and the organism? Like how is that not um then making like if it's also an explanation for intelligence, like it sounds like they're trying to solve, they've started out just solving intelligence and then they tried to apply it to solve both intelligence and homeostasis. And when they do that, it seems to me they change the relationship between the theory and the whole theory of, neo-Darwinism, like the theory of replicators. So how is that used? Is that not discussed, or is that just papered over, or
Yeah, I mean, so there's also an argument you can describe the sort of evolutionary process as a free energy minimizing process, where you look at populations, the evolution of populations over time as being something that is I guess the generation of an individual is a guess, and that individual is either something that is successful or not successful, and then you learn. I mean, so that's not unique, I suppose, to the free energy principle. This idea that there's a interesting similarity between an evolutionary process and an inferential process. But the free energy principle is um, one of the approaches, I guess, that has tried to make that case. And that's sometimes used when I'm talking about these kind of processes like metamorphosis that look like they're the breakdown of a model and the transition to a completely different model. You say, well, you zoom out and you look at the level of the population, and at the level of the population, these kind of behaviors are part of something that the population has converged on, a stable life cycle, that is this kind of repeating cycle of, say, the butterfly. Um, so that was related to the evolution part. In terms of which I can maybe come back to because I don't know if I spoke to what your question was there. But in relation to the other question, which was this began as like a theory of human intelligence, and then was generalized to be this thing that applies to single cells. I actually think as a theory of what we're doing when we are complex cognizing systems, something like predictive processing, which is a kind of particular story of cognition that's consistent with the free energy principle, isn't a bad story. Um, if we say that living systems are these kind of unpredictable, unprestatable processes, then how do they regulate themselves? There is a sense in which life is not just this continuity of a metabolic process, but it also involves regulation. And I think some aspects of regulation and predictive regulation are well described by the free energy principle. Um, I guess the sorry, maybe to come back, I think the issue is that to say something is predictive, we're not just saying there's two senses of predictive. There's this is correlated with this, and there's this is trying or aiming to actually get things right. And without that story of what is the system aiming to do, such we can talk of it and trying and failing, this idea of prediction is going to generalize to all sorts of things. And it doesn't sound weird to say that the human brain is predicting, because we know that the human brain, we think it's not weird to think of humans as intentional. But when we formalize that and apply it to all sorts of other systems, it kind of reveals that we haven't really accounted for what makes something predictive in the stronger intentional sense versus the just happens to be correlated with something else sense. Yeah, there were kind of various different points there, so I can try again if there were other points to your question that I didn't speak to.
I think Charlie
Hey,
dropped off because, I don't know. I know he lives in a place where there's frequent power outages because I live there too, although I'm not there now. Um, so maybe best to move on and see if other people have questions.
yeah, real quick, Kate, yeah, can you kind of just give the group, like not everyone probably has read your book yet, although like I did right away when it came out, of your sort of bioinactive approach, just
Sure,
like
yeah.
a 5 minute or something?
I think that's useful background that I would have liked to have more time to cover, but there's so many things to talk about with this. Yeah, the bioinactive approach. So where I come at that from is in I think the philosophy and the science of cognition. There has been a tendency to think that what the brain is trying to do is trying to accurately represent the world, and that's the sort of first purpose of cognition. The general threat of an inactive approach is to say that what the brain is trying to do is coordinate perception and action. And in the process of coordinating perception and action, we might come to form structures in our brains that are similar to structures out there, but that's a side effect of the need to coordinate our actions. And then that raises a whole set of issues in terms of, like, if we're saying we are coordinating our actions, that means we need this notion of what are they coordinated towards, what is the goal of coordination. And what the bioinactive story does is draws on the notion of autopoiesis, the notion of systems that produce themselves, and says that action is in the service of autopoiesis, it's in the service of continued self-production. So there's like a two-part story. There's the sensory motor regulation, and there's the what is that in service of? It's in the service of continued survival, which is self-production. And a lot of the issues, I think, with that approach come down to how do we define self-production? Is that something like actual sort of molecular synthesis and chemical reactions that build physical structures? Or could self-production just be something like a loop of processes that cause each other and depend upon each other, but aren't actually creating any physical structures? The first kind of notion of self-production is very restrictive. The second is very, very general, and you might think the second is too general because all sorts of processes are mutually dependent. The hydrological cycle of the planet is a network of processes that all depend upon each other. Do we want to say that's a self-producing autopoietic system? But then do we want to constrain it only to single cells? Because then that seems like it's not very useful for explaining multicellular creatures like us. And I think that's where things like the free energy principle come in, where we try and describe this in a way that allows self-production to be more generalizable, but end up making it too generalizable. um,
I'm so sorry, Kate. My power blinked off in the middle of what you were saying earlier, and um, so I didn't get. So, like, I guess I would restate the question as, um, is the free energy principle the cause of heritable variation in this theory, or is it not?
yeah. So what I would say, I mean, one thing that is often an issue is there's no real story about causation here. It's all about probabilistic relationships, and those are often talked about as being causal, which is not a good move to make, right? There's a big difference between a causal relationship and a statistical relationship. Um,
Right.
as a principle, one of the things that people often object to with it is what is a principle, right? There's a whole load of philosophical discussions around, is this a principle? Is this a law? Is it a force? And if it was a force, then you might think of it as something that could be more construed in causal terms, like that somehow, yeah, the sort of force of free energy minimization drives action in the world. I think that would be I think that would be a misguided way to think of it. But there is a real tendency of that, of like interpreting our mathematical descriptions as being causal, which I think is a mistake far beyond the free energy principle. Um,
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, real quickly, I mean, I understand the reason for making a fundamental assumption that, we look at life and what we see, the most obvious thing is that, it's making itself and that it's all really about persistence. But what if that's actually even, what if you go back to someone like, we're getting out there because we don't really know how to approach it from a scientific point of view, but philosophically, someone like Whitehead or someone like Plotinus or someone like John Vervaeke kind of updating Plotinus to the modern day, and what if the fundamental thing is really about, in a certain way, the universe exploring itself and life, each individual life is a distinction of the one in a certain way, and really the fundamental thing is about the universe exploring novelty. you know Not that all these models aren't going to be useful, but whether or not that's really a fundamental thing, I think is actually an open question. Sorry for
yeah,
that.
no, I think I really like this kind of emphasis on exploring novelty, because I think that's another thing you don't get from a regulatory story of purposiveness. Because if what drives the system is regulation, then what drives the system is staying the same. And it looks like it's exploring novelty. When a machine learning algorithm explores all these possible configurations, that looks like exploration. But I think you can really describe that exploration as just a path to not exploring. It's a path to stability. And I think that's precisely what's interesting about life, is because it's not about staying the same. It can be about expansion, exploration, development. And so my kind of like reference for this at the moment is I've been reading a bit of Nietzsche, who I haven't read in a very long time. But he has this whole critique of Spinoza in the Spinozan Conatus, this idea that life is driven to preserve itself. And I think what he says is really like very kind of beautifully ahead of its time in how he thinks about living systems, and maybe tied to other problematic things in other domains. But about life is about like this. It's about empowerment, right? It's about striving to do more. So if you can manage one thing, you want to manage more. If you can manage this, you want to manage more. And that's not the kind of drive you get from this minimize for energy, stay stable, keep yourself secure story. So I think there is something quite like deeply philosophical about that I quite like.
Yeah, I mean,
But I don't like harshness.
and if you'll find similar ideas in sort of in John's kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with John Vervaeke's work at all, but kind
I
of
know
his,
the relevant to realization stuff bit,
yeah,
yeah.
but his sort of all his stuff on the kind of updated view of sort of Neoplatonism in the in a modern setting and in process philosophy and in cognitive science, but also Whitehead and really, sort of just going back to Plotinus. They're really, his drive to power is very similar to maybe what Whitehead's uh, one of the God pole, yeah, and his metaphysics is kind of about.
Yeah, I think I kind of get my Whitehead secondhand. So I get my Whitehead through John Duperret, whose whole stick is philosophers of biology don't need to worry with all of the details. I'm going to give you like a simplified version of Whitehead, and you can use that for your process biology. And that's kind of my Whitehead extent so far. But hopefully, if I tune in for Matt Siegel's talk, I will get a bit deeper into Whitehead.
Totally. I mean, I think it's like, yeah, to me, that's the whole problem, the problem of plasticity, you
Mm.
know, in particular, heritable plasticity. It's like trying to, and so it really, to me, the crux is like, is the invariant part of the system the DNA? You know, like, is that the part that's being preserved or not, right? And if it is, then then that meshes perfectly with the whole biological paradigm. But if it's not,
I think there's so many strong arguments against that. I mean, even just go back to like developmental systems theory. I mean, it's much. I think there's so much evidence, even from people like Mike Levin, like in the lab, and other people working in the same kind of area, that DNA is it's part of a toolbox, like everything else. It's one. It's a fairly. It's a very stable way of doing sort of digital memory, but it isn't a fundamental. It's just one of the things that organisms can do that's useful.
Yeah, I think that's a good. Um, and that highlights like an interesting a thing that I really like about one of the examples that comes up when I try and talk about why I think we don't have invariants for living systems is that one of the lines that somebody might then go to is, well, look, the life form might change in all of these ways over time, but we know it's the same system because it has the same genetic code over time. And then you can kind of point to these cool cases of systems that don't have the same genetic code over their lifetime, that swap bits of DNA and incorporate bits of DNA. So I love these cases of like metabolic plasticity, where like a bacterium can pick up a bit of DNA, incorporate it into its structure, and now it can do something it could never do before. And that metabolic possibility wasn't part of the space that wasn't part of the possibility space of that individual before it incorporated this something that was strictly external to it. So how do you describe that with a kind of invariantist ontology? It doesn't really. It's very difficult to capture that, I think, in an invariantist or essentialist ontology of life. That ability to, like, for even DNA to be plastic, and not just in plastic in a regulatory way, but like at the level of actually changing your own genetic code. Um, and I like that simple organisms do that, right? Because people think of genetic engineering as this sophisticated thing that humans do, but loads of life forms are kind of not necessarily engineering in the sense of intentional sense, but they are certainly persisting through transformations of their DNA in ways that we can recognize that they're persisting. So I think that really highlights for me why all of the kind of common invariants we might appeal to for identifying these systems over time have these counterexamples.
I mean, even like Jablonski's work in the evolution in four dimensions or whatever she calls it. I mean, she documents a lot of real evidence where there actually is intentionality, that maybe the organism isn't thinking I'm going to change my genome,
Mm-hmm.
but the organism is doing intentional things to change, both the developmental niche and their own niche, such that they are actively, changing the genome. It isn't about random variation. I mean,
It's not
there's
random. Yeah,
a
exactly.
tremendous amount of evidence for this. It's not.
Yeah.
right, we weren't thinking that we would be changing our neurons either, right? Before we discovered neurons. Yeah, so like there are also these points where like it's obligate, like there's obligate plasticity, like crossing over, you know, I mean there's a step in just human reproduction where, every specific sequence of DNA stands some risk of being reorganized in the second generation, from the grandparents. And so there's no stable sequence that's a unit of selection, Darwinian selection. And so that doesn't match. That can't be like that anchor point of stability that the whole like system is, you know, that can't be the anchor for the pendulum or
Yeah.
whatever.
I mean, I
So
think. one kind of approach people, in, at least in the free energy literature, I think would sometimes take to deal with that is to say that that's a shuffling that is a variation on this trajectory towards something more stable. So even though I don't think this is the right response, but it's a line that they would take whether you could say all of
Mhm.
that sort of variation and shuffling is the exploration around as we converge upon this stable model. So there's still a stable model, but we are flailing around until we find a way to converge on it. And that I kind of have like a Russell's teapot kind of answer to that, where it's sort of, do you know Russell's teapot, where he's like, you know, if I say there's a tiny teapot orbiting Mars, the burden of proof is on you. And I think the same thing goes for this argument that all of these kind of processes that look like they're not about stability are really driven by an underlying stability. That's a kind of statement of faith that this will explain those things. And unless we can show that they are all about a tendency towards a deeper stability that we can't quite, that looks like it's not there but really underlies it all, that's the kind of thing that the burden of proof is on showing how they are, rather than just saying in theory they could all be explained by an underlying stability. Does that make sense? Maybe we went off on a bit of a tangent there, but
Parses to me like it parses like it cuts down two tracks like depending on whether they think like this is something that was emergent after a lot of natural selection or whether they think that this is a prerequisite for natural selection. And in that case, if it's a prerequisite for natural selection, I think you have to work a little harder. You have to make it like a testable theory. Like you have to make
yeah,
it that kind of, you have to be able to build that kind of system. And like, I mean, are people doing that? Like people trying to build a free energy minimizer or
yeah.
not?
I mean, so there are lots of people using it as a guiding framework for developing systems. I mean, both in kind of deep learning or machine learning type applications, but also there's some cool work being done on like creating little culture. I guess they're organoids, like neural organoids, that solve problems based on the free energy principle. I
Hmm.
think the problem is just because the description is so it's so flexible. I guess that's maybe what I was trying to say before, is that if
Yeah.
something seems to violate stability, you can go, but there's a deeper stability, or it's not, that system hadn't converged to stable behavior yet, but over enough time, what it's really trying to do is to converge to something stable. So you can kind of cast a lot of engineering efforts in terms of this framework.
Right.
It's just the question is whether or not it is useful. And I think in some cases it is. I think if we are trying to build a process that is essentially like a homeostatic process, then yeah, maybe this is a useful way of describing it. And maybe it is a useful way of showing how that regulation of stability can be connected to an inferential story. Those things I think are useful. But when a descriptive framework has this much flexibility, um, it does become the kind of thing that I think you could use to justify any sort of activity, but it's not clear that it's actually guiding it.
Right. Like what kind of systems, what kind of engineered systems does it rule out? You know, like
Yeah.
like I think that was one of your main criticisms in the book. It seemed to me that you're kind of trying to figure out what is it really saying can't be the case,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah. Like, so it can be made specific. So if it is committed to this view that the kind of probabilistic models that must be preserved are these, um, these, say, Gaussian distributions over a set of states, then that says something about the dynamics of the system that are consistent with it. That commits you to something. But you can avoid that commitment and still describe things in free energy minimizing terms. You can say, oh, the kind of model that's being encoded here is just a different sort of model. It's a model over possible trajectories, or it's a, you know, for example, or instead of being a model that the system has to preserve at every point in its dynamics, it could be a model that the system has to eventually converge upon, but can have all sorts of dynamics on the way. So I guess when I said at the beginning that there's lots of different variations of the free energy principle, each of these within the kind of within how you formulate it, you can formulate it in a way that does restrict you to a particular commitment about how the system must behave. And then it does become like a claim that is saying something about what kind of properties the system has to have. Once you make that commitment, it's hard to make it also describe living systems. Or you can avoid that commitment and then you have all of the freedom, but you're not really saying anything about what a system has to be like. And that's the worst place to be. And I think it's either too trivial in general, or it is like a specific defined proposal, but it's one that doesn't work. Yeah.
Totally. Wayne's got his hand up.
It seems like only me and you seem to be talking. I think, Charlie, and hopefully we get involved. But yeah, so from my point of view, and this is something I've felt kind of for a while about generally the free energy principle. I mean, you even have physicists. His name slipped my mind that can formulate quantum field theory, basically starting with the free energy principle. I think it can be really useful from a practical and engineering point of view for engineering, just like Kate said, sort of basal kind of homeostatic processes, things you might even call basal cognition in certain ways. But there's just like the whole thing seems kind of circular. Like, yeah, in a certain sense, if you're making this fundamental metaphysical assumption that it's all about, energy minimization, and this is just the way the universe is, you can always go back to that. I don't think it gives you really anything that's distinctive about life, and certainly not cognition. That's just the way I really feel about it. I think it could be really, the free energy principle itself, I'm saying, I think it can be really useful in various engineering processes. It can be useful as a model, a more reductionist model when you're trying to understand certain aspects of systems, but not kind of like for me, a global theory. I just don't buy it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think, sometimes I feel bad because a lot of what I do is focused on these criticisms, whereas I actually think I kind of like to distinguish between the free energy principle and the active inference framework. That's how I resolve it in my mind, where I think the active inference framework, which is the sort of modeling toolbox that you might use, clearly has been productive and a rich framework in a lot of cases. My problem is just with this claim to being a sort of, a foundational explanatory principle.
Okay, so either with the free energy principle or with this better inactivist framework that you believe in more, how do we get around, like, how do we deal with the transformative example? Like in a Bayesian probability distribution, if I have 1,000 examples of, like my go-to example is like trees standing right side up, with the leaves on the top and the roots down on the bottom, and I see 10 million every day examples like that. And then one day I see a tree that's got its roots in the air and its leaves on the ground. My world is transformed. Like I have a totally different explanation. I have a totally different model immediately. But if I'm a Bayesian probability distribution, nothing happens. Like that's a tiny little blip because there's so many examples that don't fit that distribution. Um, they just like overwhelm everything. And so to me, that's like the core of why I just fundamentally don't believe that current AI is anywhere near like a real, understanding of the world. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I
This
mean,
is,
yeah.
I was just
I think
real quick comment before Kate jumps in. I was thinking during your other presentation when you were talking about the, sort of the normal distribution simplification. When you look at real world problems, you're almost always dealing with fat-tailed distributions where means and variance typically don't even exist. They aren't L2 or they may not exist at all. When you make these simplifications, you're kind of ruling out the kind of distributions that really apply to life. So the question, whether or not that brain's actually doing that seems dark.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these are reasons to think that the brain has to be doing more than just statistical learning. That we are, that when we learn about things like trees upside down, we don't just apply a sort of Bayesian update to a statistical model. There is much more going on. And it's not that this is not a very cool, I think, framework. but it clearly there is a lot it can't describe. Yeah.
It's like backwards too. Like if I see that tree, like I'm not avoiding that. Like I'm curious. Like that's what curiosity is like this weird example that you pursue. Like you go after it. Like you go interact with it because it completely transforms your picture of the world. And I don't see that at all. Like it seems like this, I mean, we didn't talk about the dark room problem, but there's like this
Yeah.
idea you just convert everything into a dark room, even your internal homeostatic processes, you can convert into a dark room. You can minimize surprise by like never pursuing novelty. I mean, that seems so basic and fundamentally problematic. Like that, that's like the whole thing, in a way.
Yeah,
Um,
and like there's lots of responses to that in the literature, but I think none of them are principled. So it's not that you can't describe that kind of thing. You can say, well, individual organisms inherit a kind of hard-coded prior from their parents that has been developed through evolution that leads them away from dark rooms. But that's not a principled story.
right,
Why?
but how?
um,
That's like
so
that's
yeah.
that's contradicting the whole theory. Like,
So like yeah, there's a whole lot of ways you can deal with that in tons of ways, just not solely within the constraints of deriving it from a principle of free energy minimization. Um,
right, right, yeah,
I think Henry
Could
has
I
something.
ask some question?
yeah. Jump in, yeah. Go.
Okay. So I enjoy your talk. I have a simple question. So for the principle you're talking about, so I'm a biologist, right? So if you apply to the biology, so what question biology currently cannot solve, but you can offer the insight for this? So that's the first question. So how we can use your thinking to really help understanding biology, just from which angle? For example, if you can find one question, right? So you're thinking, you explain it very differently,
Hmm.
or we should follow the way to thinking to explain things differently. So that's the first question.
Hmm. I guess what I'm most interested in, which maybe is more of a philosopher's interest than a biologist's interest, but maybe a neuroscientist's interest at least, which is a subfield of biology, is how do we explain what the brain is supposed to do? How do we, so, and like to explain that, what I mean is when you're looking at something like the brain, obviously there's so much going on there. And when you're modeling it, you're trying to identify what are the mechanisms, what are the behaviors, and what are just the accidental contingent events. Um, and this is such a kind of underlying problem in all these debates in neuroscience. Like, are oscillations epiphenomenal or are they part of cognition? We have all of these questions of, is this stuff epiphenomenal or is it like an actual cognitive process? And we need to answer that to kind of know, or like, is the neural code a rate code or is it spike timing important? These kinds of questions are all questions about which aspects of that observed activity are relevant to the thing we're trying to explain, and the thing we're trying to explain is cognition. But we don't have a good view of what cognition is. And the thing that motivates me is this idea that by understanding what living is, by understanding what it means to stay alive as a system, we can then develop an account of what cognition is that helps us answer some of these questions about which aspects of neural activity, and not just neural activity, but all of the stuff that goes on in the brain, are cognitive processes, and how do those cognitive processes develop from sort of more basic vital processes. And that, I get that that's probably sounds quite a vague philosopher's concern, but
Yeah,
maybe
sure.
one example that I think is cool here is spontaneous activity, where spontaneous activity in the brain is kind of maybe a mechanism for creativity, but it's also a mechanism that's key to like maintaining the actual integrity of the cells that make up a nervous system. So you have this sort of cell integrity process of having to randomly fire to sort of regulate your energy balance to make sure you don't get a buildup of to make sure that oh god, my molecular biology is going to lose me here. It's quite late here. But to make sure that basically, you know, the channel that drives the ATP synthase doesn't get gummed up, because if it gets gummed up, it's bad for the cell. So you fire to stop that whole respiratory chain complex and chain getting gummed up. That's driven by a biological drive for integrity, but also seems to be tied to this much more high level cognitive process of potentially creativity. Now that's like all very speculative, but that's a different way of looking at what the brain's doing when you think about it as a biological system in this much more kind of metabolically grounded way, rather than just thinking of it as made up of these kind of mechanical little wires, which, you know, sometimes we have a tendency to do. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer, but
Yeah,
that's
it's that's good. So I think that, you know, I listen to you emphasize or you de-emphasize or you emphasize, let me know, the stability themselves. So because that actually is a quite interesting question, because currently most of the biologists understand the stability wrong in a way, because for example, for evolution, people traditionally always thinking is for the sake of the change, but in fact, the most fundamental the function of evolution is just maintain the stability. So if you're thinking that way, so the many questions, you know, just resolved without further discuss. For example, we know DNA is very, you know, kinds of hardcore, kinds of component information, right? But the DNA, all the information is because by the higher level to reorganize the physical relationship between these codes. So therefore, what is stability? I mean, all the different species is the evidence of stability. So the evolution actually have nothing to do, it's not really about the reproduction or whatever, but rather than the different system that can be replaced in the direction of increase the information complexity. So if you're thinking that way, I mean, all this, you know, DNA change doesn't count if they cannot into the game of higher level, for example, the genome, that determine the boundary of the network. So if you are not in this boundary, you instantly be washed out, you disappear. So therefore, everything can be exist and have the future become something more. You have to have the stable status.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually, I think it's quite interesting. You're thinking about, because we separate life and non-life, also the stability, but the way to achieve them is fundamentally different.
Mm-hmm.
One way is biological way, one is physical way. But physical way is therefore they don't have future, have new information. But biology actually is because of that, they produce the new information for the future.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that part is quite interesting. So even people talking about epigenetics, talking about all the dynamics, all of this is within the boundary of which species you are, right? So that's actually quite interesting in terms of talking about neural function, because they could have both ways. One way is use dynamics to achieve the stability, but one way is use the stability themselves to achieve the stability, or dynamics as such. So I'm interested into the how, you know, your way of thinking actually can actually help, but whether or not in the entity of biology, even your free energy law will slightly change or will completely change, because that mechanism may be not applied to biology, right? So in that case, we actually have a much more you know, open way to thinking about this, especially we're talking about the cognition. If that is another higher way of dealing with the information, I think that could be very interesting. But anyway, so what I try to say, my point is currently many of evolutionary thinking currently is incorrect. So if you use that to judge your theory, you'll get much more confused.
Yeah. No, I've been teaching philosophy of evolutionary biology lately, and it's an interesting
because
interesting set of
that
confusions and debates.
we're confused because everything could be opposite as you're talking about. So I mean, Charlie talking about this all the being highly dynamic. Say in bacterial, the horizontal gene transfer, everything high dynamic because they don't have a mechanism to stabilize. So that goes to nowhere. 3.5 billion years goes to nowhere. So that's the key. That's the key to thinking about the cognition because you have to have very stable system to build upon the cognition, rather than at the very beginning you have a high level of such. Right. So in this way to thinking about it, so therefore I think in the all stability you have to focus on system level, not the components level. So now the evolution have three level. One is component, one is organism, one is ecosystem. Each of them is moving simultaneously. So now we're doing many of experiments. We just get a new species, but put in the wrong ecosystem also doesn't work. I mean, this is totally, right now for the cognition study, everyone's doing this match about everything. Even for the AI, I mean, they do not need understand the human. They do not need smarter than human, but they could kill us, replace us because of that, right? So they may 10,000 times stupid than human, but they could replace us because if they got the right ecosystem, that's all it takes. Anyway, I stop here. Yeah.
I have a question that somewhat piggybacks off of what Henry is saying. I wanted to ask you about integrity because I really love the example you used of the slime mold. And I don't know enough about slime mold to know how quickly the parts shed and how much parts interact with each other before being replaced by different parts. So can you please talk about the continuity of a slime mold's components experience as they shed and pick up in terms of integrity? And I like the systems focus that Henry brought.
Yeah, so in the example I had there, I think it was just around there's a couple of different papers on it, and in some of them they say it's as short as just a few minutes that the entire membrane is degraded and regenerated. In terms of the continuity, my argument, I suppose, would be is that what gives that continuity, even though the entire thing is being rebuilt, is what rebuilds that membrane is the metabolism inside the slime mold. That metabolism can only occur because the membrane is protecting it. And then you see how that metabolism leads to the regeneration of that membrane. So you have that circular dependence in a very restrictive sense where it's not just two processes cycling around, but a physical structure depending upon another physical structure that rebuilds it. So that's the thing that gives you the continuity, even though all of the material stuff is like flowing through it at a much faster rate than the existence of the slime mold. So it's not just that the regeneration happens quickly, but that the regeneration happens on timescales that are much faster than the lifespan of the organism, I guess. But for a more kind of detailed kind of breakdown of exactly what's going on there, I'd have to go back to the papers.
No, this is fascinating. I really like the idea of everything being in flux. So it's really fun for me to sit here and to imagine slime mold doing its thing.
I think, yeah, I suppose maybe the other thing is I'd say that the thing that has always appealed to me about these loosely autopoietic or self-producing frameworks is I think you sometimes have this other direction that you can go, which is maybe the line that John Dupre takes more, where it's all much more processual and fluid. And he has this like promiscuous individualism where it's not necessarily clear where the boundaries of individuals are. And I feel I wouldn't want to go that far. I think there is something really fluid and fluxy about things like a slime mold. But what we want is a way to incorporate that and still have a sense of these distinct individuals, both for pragmatic reasons of, doing scientific modeling, but also I think for very important philosophical reasons where I think if we give up on the idea that there are selves that are consistent throughout this flux, that actually causes a whole load of downstream philosophical issues that I would prefer to avoid.
Thank you. It's fascinating.
Oh, I think Mary Lynn had a question.
Did you just call on me?
Yeah. I think Charlie might have
Hi.
disconnected again. Sorry, I'll do it myself.
Have you considered or have you come across any thinkers who are trying to reconcile or integrate homeoresis with the free energy principle? And I see Bill is still in the room. I bet he has something to say about this. So anyway, I am asking you, Kate, but if is William Miller is still here, if he's raised his hand and had something to offer, I think that would be an interesting conversation between you two as well.
Cool, yeah, I'll let you go first, Bill. Oh, I think you're on mute, sorry.
So do you have any thoughts on that, Kate?
Oh, sorry, I think Bill was speaking, but he was on mute. I don't
Oh,
know.
it was on mute. Okay, I'm having a hard time hearing everyone, period. So
I don't know if I can unmute.
I can't hear Bill at all.
Yeah, it says he's muted.
Strange.
Oh, I'm
there
sorry.
we
I'm,
No worries.
Carolyn, I don't want to interrupt you. Please go first.
Okay. I mean, in terms of stability of dynamics, like what I've talked about this as though it has to be about stability of state. There's no real reason why it does. You can make the free energy principle work in terms of stability of trajectories or dynamics as well. I don't think that solves a lot of the problems with it, but that is a line that people have been pushing a bit more in more recent work on this.
I'm sorry, guys. My when I try to turn on my video, it kicks me off as the host, and I have to re-log in again. So I think you guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. Yeah, sorry. I was trying to moderate and losing my thread, but great. Yeah.
I'll make a few comments if I may. Thank you, Mary, for introducing homeoresis. So, Kate, as I'm sure you know, there's a problem with the term homeostasis because it doesn't reflect what cells do.
Mm-hmm.
And my direct focus is on cells. That's what my comments will be about. There's a concept of dynamic stability, which is the essence of cellular life. And unfortunately, homeostasis tends to be equated in people's minds with equilibrium. And that's the one thing that is never enacted within the living state. It's always dynamic flux.
Mm-hmm.
I think your focus on enactivism is a very good one. I will say that I do think that there's a use to the free energy principle, but only as a loose framework. And I think the problem with it is it's meant to be a theory of mind, of the brain, and you can't understand cognition from the brain down because it's from cells up and from brain down to individual cells. It's a reciprocating process. Cognition emanates from cellular interactions that the brain interprets. So the free energy principle offers two useful things, at least from my perspective. One is it discusses Markov blankets and boundaries so that there's conditional independence between the cellular inside and the outside of the cell. And it talks about the concept of the minimization of surprisal, as you emphasized. And that's a narrowing of the distinctions on the adjacent. That's narrowing informational ambiguity. And that's what cells seek to do. And they seek to do that to maintain their states of preference. So in getting to Wayne's excellent question, which was, what can be investigated in the free energy principle that would be useful, empirically investigated and be potentially useful? I think if we look at the issue from cells and how they conduct info computation for amplitude and valence to support a states of preference, we can look into several things. How do cells, why, when, how, and which tools cells use to suppress surprisal, for survival, how, why, when, and who they choose to partner with to do the same. That's synergism. And we can investigate also the terms of Markov blankets and boundaries, because those are primarily invested within the plasma membrane. So all of those things are accessible to us with modern tools. So whether or not the free energy principle is mathematically correct, I think is of less interest than the very general concept of conditional independence and minimization of surprisal is useful. And I would end by saying the inactive approach that you emphasize, Kate, is very worthwhile. What I think few people really understand is that cells are a niche construction.
Mhm.
Competent cells are a self-created niche construction, and they self-create an internal generated interpretation of external reality, and then they use that to conduct external niche constructions to support that internal state of reality, which is also equal to their state of preference. They're always trying to reach that moment. So I think your work I think you're correct in pointing out some problems with the free energy principle, but I don't think your work is completely incompatible with it. And I think that there could be a happy marriage if you interpret the free energy principle quite loosely.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think, when you give a talk, you focus on a few things, and I end up focusing on the criticisms. And I think there are a lot of them. But when I was saying how one of the issues with this framework is that it's under constrained, and that gives you too much sort of descriptive freedom in saying, we can describe all of these sorts of systems. What I see, sorry, I've got a bit of a cold. Sorry about that. What I see, this kind of what I would think of as maybe like a metabolism first or an energetics first approach is doing, is giving you a way to constrain how you apply the free energy principle, how you apply the free energy framework that is principled. So how you constrain what kind of models a living system can instantiate. I don't think the free energy framework doesn't give you a way to derive what sort of models can count as viable in principle. Something like this kind of metabolic account gets you a notion of viability that then you can use to say maintaining viability depends on the regulation of these flows of matter and energy. But in order to decide what the system is supposed to be doing, we need to first tell that kind of energetic metabolic story, and then that gives us a way of constraining this descriptive framework that can make it useful. It just can't stand on its own.
I'm not sure if this I'm not sure if this is the right time to mention this or ask this question, but to me there's a fundamental difference between minimizing surprise. Like the word surprise, I think, is a really powerful word and really useful, and really, like, I think that might be the main, like, in the long run, I think that might be the main contribution that the free energy principle makes, is like introduction of this.
The word isn't really surprise. It's surprisal, which is really meant to be prediction error. I don't want to nitpick, but I agree. The word surprise has so many embedded problems with it. I completely agree with you. But I do want to emphasize that Friston doesn't mean it like for surprise.
Right, it's unintentional. Yeah, I
It's
think
not
you're
his
right.
fault either. Like, it's a
You're
sort of
right.
long historical thing to call this surprisal. And
Yeah.
normally when I give talks, I try and sort of disambiguate and talk in terms of like unlikeliness or I mean, really all it is in the free energy principle often is just infrequency, which is even more of a minimal notion.
Right.
Or variability.
It's a mistake, but I think it's a mistake. Like it's inaccurate. It doesn't come from the theory, right? It's an inaccurate, like it's an appropriation of a real thing that happens. Like when we actually do cognition, we encounter surprises and we change our mind. Like, which is totally different from minimizing surprises, right? Like changing your mind, making a discovery.
It's
is totally unrelated to minimizing prediction error. Like, and
It's
so
the kind of thing, yeah, as a
like
philosopher,
to me,
like, can we just stop calling it surprisal? You're like, let's just not use that word because it confuses people, because it's like, it's easy to like, and when people talk about this, they often slip into saying surprise.
cheating.
I probably did it because it's weird to say surprisal. It's an awkward word and it sounds like surprise. So you naturally sort of say surprise and then people think you mean surprise. And if it was just called something better,
It's
like
cheating. And but
variability,
yeah,
we
but
wouldn't have dependence.
the reason why it's cheating is because the explanation starts and ends in the wrong domain.
Hmm.
Like surprise is something that happens in the domain of the individual. And that's why surprise, the real surprise, is something cognitive. Like to me, this whole the problem with the prediction error the whole thing about all these theories of cognition, that's the problem, is that they're all about survival and reproduction, where the feedback mechanism is selection. And the domain is the domain of the lineage. It's not the domain of the individual. Like it doesn't give you a way to get into the domain of the individual. Like all these theories of cognition are using they're they're using cognition as a gene. They're representing cognition as a gene. And so that to me is why all these things don't work. And I just wonder, like, Kate, have you encountered that problem? Like, how do you encounter that problem? How do you encounter that difficulty? Like,
Yeah, I think so. For me, I think it's one of the deepest sources of confusion in this whole literature is
right.
that we have terms like surprisal or even prediction error, right? Because prediction error sounds like I've made a prediction with the intention of getting it right, whereas really it's more just um, this thing either there's those two notions of prediction I talked about where you have prediction in the sense of predict to somebody this smoke predicts fire versus I see smoke and predict fire, and it means two completely different things there. And the same is true with a term like surprisal that sounds that it means something intentional, something that an individual is doing, versus just surprisal in the kind of information theoretic sense or in the statistical sense. And it drives me insane because these mean completely different things. But I think one of the reasons often people care less about that is if you have a view where so I guess the sort of philosophical term we might use is like the difference between a personal level term and a subpersonal term. And I think for a lot of people, that distinction between a personal level description, something that an individual does, a subpersonal process, which just might be something like variation or covariation, is often seen as a useful simplification that we're making. So there's this kind of the Dennettian intentional stance approach, I think, is a very popular one in cognitive science and in philosophy of cognitive science. And if you have that kind of intentional stance view, then the distinction between these kind of personal level notions of surprisal and prediction and these more statistical or information theoretic notions, it's not as important to see those as completely different things because one is an approximation of the other. Whereas if you think that there's a kind of real difference in kind that happens when you get individuals and intentional agents on the scene, then you're going to care about the difference between personal level surprise and subpersonal surprisal. But many people don't care as much as I think they should.
People don't care as much as they should, but they have to care because everything that's inherited from the level of the lineage gets modified at the level of the individual and inherited again. So there's no way around that. Like when you look at regeneration and you look at epigenetic inheritance and horizontal gene transfer and everything else, there's no the, yeah. I mean, I've sort of already said it, but that distinction matter. That distinction is like huge. That's like the whole the whole problem is in that distinction. Like the whole issue, the whole block, like the blocker.
I mean, I think so across all sorts of domains. I think so many different kind of problems in so many different domains come down to what do we mean by the individual? How do we individuate individuals?
Right.
But I agree with you, but that's not everyone agrees with us, I guess. But yeah, sorry. Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think people aren't sensitive to that distinction because the neo-Darwinian paradigm is so huge and so powerful. They assume that that can't be a distinction for some. Sorry, Wayne's got his hand up again.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing, yeah, unfortunately, you have to understand this is kind of tangential. I mean, the root of a lot of our issues and our stalemate in science that physics is kind of maybe starting to come out of a little bit, but biology is slowly coming out of it. This all goes back to Newton and Descartes and Galileo, and you have to understand. So the people that were the founders of dynamical systems theory and this whole view of the universe in terms of efficient cause and just things bouncing off each other, and this is the way the universe works. They knew what they were bracketing out. They knew it was an explanation of all reality. This was the things that we could quantitatively measure. That has become so pervasive in every aspect of our society, and it's really accelerated in the computational age. It's a very difficult thing to fight because people are completely blind to the kind of distinction you're talking about. They don't even see it because they're making these fundamental assumptions that everything that is real can be eventually down to these particles bouncing into each other in efficient cause. I mean, we need new stories and mythos. Unfortunately, I don't see another way around it.
Can we dive into that a little bit? I'm sorry. While we have you here, Kate, I didn't do a good job of letting you give your account of efficient causation and constraint closure, and how that really works. Can we do that? I mean, is that a
Yeah,
little tell we could
I
down
need to go
real
in a
quick?
few minutes because I'm
Oh,
supposed to be
okay.
in somewhere.
Okay. That's a big can of worms to open at like 10 minutes to the to close.
I think
Yeah.
maybe the like suggestive thing I would say, which is how a lot of the constraint closure people talk about it, is that all of these physical models assume constraints. Whenever you're trying to build a dynamical systems model, you assume your constraints that give you your phase space, the possibilities your system can be in, and all of that depends on stipulating those constraints. The cool thing about living systems is they create their own constraints, and that changes everything. That would be my like super quick elevator pitch that doesn't really tell you anything, but sounds cool.
They also change the dynamical model all the time. So there's two things going on. They create their own constraints and they do
and
it
they change their constraints.
intentionally, and they change the relationships. Like I used to struggle with this as a mathematician, trying to come up with a way. How do I even approach this problem? It was before I understood sort of some of the stuff Rosen was doing that helps a little bit. Anyway.
Yeah. I would love to ask you more about that actually, but yeah.
Yeah, there's much
if
more.
you
I
have
mean,
time to, a question I get a lot is like, how do you deal with this kind of thing that I'm talking about mathematically? And I'm not a mathematician, and I guess there are these cool frameworks, but I don't really know how to answer your question because I'm not a mathematician. So if you have thoughts on that, I would love to hear them, maybe by email. But
yeah, I think we're going to have plenty of time to get into that in the next few meetings too.
yeah,
Yogi Jaeger is the next one in like 4
excellent. That'd be cool.
Yeah, so I think there'll be plenty of time. Yeah. Yeah, great. All right, guys. Well, does anyone else have anything burning to ask before we wrap it up?
No, but I got a fussy baby, so I will see you guys later. This is Ricky. Hi.
Oh, thank you. Hey,
Bye, guys.
a cameo. Bye, Kim. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for having me. That was such a fun discussion.
Awesome. Yeah, wonderful. That was a blast. And I hope you'll keep joining us.
Yeah.
And you really
Thanks,
crossed.
thanks to loads, Kate. Please, I mean, there's a lot more richness to your book than what came out in this whole discussion, and hopefully some of it will come out over the next 3 or 4 or 5 sessions. And I really do hope people take the time to read the book.
I always say I'm better in writing than in person, and I think that's true. So.
Yeah, the book is really punchy. It punches a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.